The next one is Jeroen van Leeuwen. He's a project leader at Natuurbalans and DMS Divergence. That's an ecological consultancy firm in the Netherlands. As an ecological researcher, he is interested in the role of soil organisms in ecosystems functioning, both as indicators for and driver of the provision of ecosystem services. And today, he's going to tell us something a bit different, but anyway, he is going to tell us more about a slightly different topic, the Western saddle bush cricket Ephippiger diurnus in the Netherlands. Jeroen.
Good morning. Indeed, my background is more soil related than the content of this topic, but I'm going to talk about the Western saddle bush cricket, which is one of the rare grasshopper species in the Netherlands, and we have run several projects on this species. I'll show you a bit of the occurrence in the Netherlands, the decline over the last decades, and what we try to do to bring that back to its former spread. What you see here is the map of the distribution of the species in the Netherlands. In gray patches are the ones before 2006. You see there's a bit wider spread than the red dots, which is the more recent distribution. And even the red dots have decreased since then. I'll tell you a bit later about. The species is limited to the dry heathlands in the Netherlands. For those who do not know the Netherlands, this is the Veluwe area, which is a high, dry, sandy area with a lot of heathlands. And there are several patches here in the higher areas of South Limburg. And this rare dot in the north, that's an extreme outlier of which I do not know the origin. All of these points are still within nature reserves, so the species does not occur outside nature reserves. If you plot it on the elevation map of the Netherlands, you can clearly see what I just highlighted. The species occur in the higher areas. So here's the Veluwe. There were former dots here on the Utrechtse Heuvelrug, which is also a glacial moraine. Nijmegen here, the area is also a glacial moraine. And there's a few dots here in the hills in the southern part of Limburg. In this spot, the species is gone since almost 2 decades at least. And now the main distribution is here and a bit more here. When we started this research, there were about 16 populations in the Netherlands. And the populations on the map here are focused on the Veluwe. This is the central area of the Netherlands. And even on the large Veluwe area, which has a lot of heathlands, you can see that even decades ago, already the distribution was very limited to small patches of heathland. So here it was all empty, and then here's a few patches, and here in the northern parts. Many of these populations have either gone or decreased in size, which is also a bit shown here. This is the more focused in on the Veluwe zone, which is the south of the Veluwe. And you see here, this is all heathland. You see, even in a single area, it's focused on very specific regions within the heathlands. It's either due to microclimate or habitat structure. I'll come back to that later. But even on a single heathland, it's rather focused in its distribution. And even in these well-populated areas, it has been decreasing in the last decades. So what does the Western saddle bush cricket needs as a habitat? In the Netherlands, it lives in heathlands. So vegetation dominated by heather, Calluna vulgaris. And the major part of this heathland is older structured heathland. So larger clumps of old heather bushes and open sandy spots in between. And this enables the grasshopper to find the right microclimate, warm up rapidly, move around a bit more. So if the vegetation becomes too dense, the movability is decreasing. So it does not doesn't prefer that as well. And it needs the open spots between the heathland clumps or the heather clumps to deposit the eggs, mostly open sandy spots. And apart from the Calluna bushes, it also needs a couple of herb species to feed on. The majority of the diet is Calluna vulgaris. We've shown, I think, Bouwman will come back to that later on this congress. But it also eats on several other herb species, and as an adult it's omnivorous, so it also needs insects to feed on. And that's what it needs in the variety in the heathland vegetation. And the males find vocalization spots in the higher areas of the vegetation structure, so the outlying bushes, the young trees, and the very old, large heather clumps. Oh, wrong button. So this is what a structured heathland in the Netherlands looks like. It's dominated by Calluna vulgaris, but you can clearly see the older clumps and the more open areas in between. And in the background you see a bit of younger trees and pine trees. And that's what they use as a vocalization point. You see here a female that has just mated with the spermal package at the abdomen. And especially the nymphs you also find in the herbaceous vegetations in between the Calluna clumps. This is on wood sage. When you look at the populations in the Netherlands, I mentioned before there were 16 populations in the past, or at least the last couple of decades, and now only 6 remain. The red crosses are populations that are gone, and also Nationalpark de Hoge Veluwe and Planken Wambuis, they were still noted as strongly declining here, but in the meantime they have been extinct as well. And you see a clear decrease in populations. This 2040 dot is of course a prediction, but it will more likely be leveling off, but still the trend is critical. The main reason for decline for the species in the Netherlands is the loss of the habitat quality, as far as we know. And there's a number of reasons, but the main reason here is the nitrogen deposition. In the Netherlands in the years of 60, 70, there was a sulfur deposition and a strong acidification as a result of that. That's been banned, luckily, but now nitrogen deposition has taken over and there's still a strong acidification process going on. And especially the dry heathlands, which are basically scarce vegetation, they really have a strong impact on that. It's a combination of acidification and eutrophication. Acidification is leaching out all the base cations that are buffering the system, and eutrophication becomes a more dense vegetation. The increase in grasses and forests, that's the result of eutrophication. So if there's more nutrients in the soil, grasses will come up, and the Calluna is dominating the vegetation when there's less nutrients. So you get a more grassy vegetation, which is not good for the saddle bush cricket because of its thermoregulation demands and the limited protection possibilities in that area. Eutrophication also leads to a moss domination on the ground level. So if you look at a heathland nowadays, there's a large chance that the open soil is mostly dominated by mossy and lichen vegetation types. And that impacts the microclimate in the soil. It needs the open sandy areas for the eggs to really warm up and incubate it. Even in the open areas, it takes 2 winters to come out. And when there's a moss layer on top, the soil temperatures go down, the humidity goes up, and incubation is mostly blocked. And there's also a decrease in herbaceous species in the heathlands in the Netherlands. It's now more and more dominated by Calluna vulgaris by itself, and all the other herb species are gone because of the acidification mostly. All the base cations in the soil are leached out, and for plants there's not much to find anymore except for nitrogen in most cases. And that gives a loss of a food source for the nymphs and a loss of insect community as a whole on which the adults also feed on. Here's a picture of what I mentioned as a moss layer on top of the soil. What you see here is a lot of moss in between the heather clumps, And what it used to be was open sand between the header clumps where the eggs are deposited. Now the whole deposition range is basically gone. Well, since 2004, Natuurbalance is really focusing on this species to protect and get back what is lost. And the first was a species protection plan. Later on in 2018, the protection management actions were more detailed and more applied. But it was still mainly focused on above ground vegetation structure and what needs to be done to get that back. And earlier this year, we presented the reports to the province of Gelderland in this case, which has the main population area. And in this case, we also look at soil chemistry as the main underlying reason for the vegetation structure decline. And of that last report, I'll tell a bit more about what has been done and what will we do in the future. The aims of this report were the recovery and stabilization of populations of the western saddle bush crickets. And the major difference between this report and the previous report is that we focus on the habitat recovery and thereby restore the entire ecosystem, and instead of just focus on the species that we want to protect. And with that, we look at the system as a whole and protect species richness and nutrient balance and stoichiometry in the vegetation in order to protect or improve the dry header. And there's a couple of phases in this recovery process. We start off with a selection of the suitable habitat areas. In this case, the places where the species is still occurring or where it's been gone recently. In those areas, we analyzed together with the Research Institute Beware the soil chemistry and plant chemistry. And based on that, and also on the above ground vegetation structure, we advised the application of specific management practices. That can either be burning the vegetation or raking the moss in between the header clumps, or choppering, which is basically deep mowing, removing the litter layer, or grazing in areas where there's too much of a grass domination. After these practices have taken place, we want to restore the soil nutrient status based on the soil samples that were taken in the soil chemistry that was analyzed. And advice came out to apply, for example, a rock powder or dolocal, which is a calcium supplement, or even fertilization in the form of phosphorus additions where needed based on the measuring of the measured soil nutrient status. And when basically the abiotic and surrounding conditions are recovered, we can bring back the herbs that were formerly growing in the vegetation there by seeding or transplantation of hay. And when the habitat is restored, we bring back the grasshopper itself. The aim is, of course, the structured header as the habitat of the western saddle bush cricket. At first, the soil nutrient status, which is the most dominant factor changing the habitat quality in this point. For this, soil samples were taken place at all the areas where the grasshopper is still living or was living, and the data from those samples was compared to a GRIP database, which is a database set up by the Research Institute Beware, in which they also have like reference sites in which they measured all the soil elements, nutrient elements, and we can compare that to well-structured heathlands and well-structured Nardus grasslands, which harbor the same grass species and same herbaceous species. This is an example for how that is working. So the gray area is the reference sites in which the data, in this case the base saturation, should be lying. There's only one site in the Netherlands which is still okay, which is the Oldenburgse Heide, the largest saddle bush cricket population. And all the other ones have strongly decreased in base saturation. To bring that back, you can apply several soil amendments. It can either be dolocal, as I mentioned, the calcium amendment, rock powder, which several types are used throughout in the Netherlands right now. They differ in, for example, magnesium content or potassium, and fertilization where needed, where, for example, the nitrogen-phosphorus ratios is not good enough. This is how we presented it to the terrain owners, which can either be municipalities or nature conservation organizations. And in black you see the soil samples, and for example in red the removal of the moss. In this case you see it's a small scale method that allow for habitat variation and different types of management to see what's actually working best. In some cases it will be the calcium by itself, in some cases it will be rock powder. We don't know yet, most of these methods are still experimental, but we applied it to all the populated areas. Then to bring back the herbs, you can either do it by seeding or distributing of hay. And well, the first part of the slide I already mentioned before. The effects of the management actions should be monitored, both soil chemistry and plant chemistry and vegetation structure, and only if the whole package is complete again, we can move on to bring back the bush cricket itself. And for that we started a breeding program. So since 2019 we're actually breeding this grasshopper in Nijmegen. And we collected nymphs from all the remaining populations in the Netherlands. And we did a genetic analysis to see which is the most genetically diverse populations that can be best used as a source population. And in that case, Oldenbroek and Mulderskop near Nijmegen were the most diverse populations that should be used for reintroductions and also for boosting the current populations where needed. For example, the Zanding, where the population has been going down for years. This is what it looks like in the lab. So the cages in which the grasshoppers are breeding. And we incubated the eggs over 2 years in the incubator, and then last year actually the first boost of grasshoppers came out. And hopefully this year a lot more. And yeah, basically it's now time for action in the field. So we have the captive program. We've basically assured the money from the provinces for applying these actions, and we're talking to landowners now to apply the management practices that we've advised. And hopefully in the fall of this year the first actions are taking place, and next year we can bring back the first grasshoppers in areas that are already okay. And with this I want to thank you for your attention, and maybe there are questions.
Thank you very much. As I have already proven to be a very bad chair because we are running out of time. I can allow one question, one short question. Anybody want a short question for Jeroen? No one? Not on the...
There's one question by Lonneke Klein-Aerts, and she wants to see the report, and she cannot find it online. Is it available somewhere?
Not yet.
Ah, not yet.
It's available for the province, but not yet for the landowners. We still need to talk to them.
Okay, that will
and
follow
after that
later.
It will be published.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Jeroen.